I've actually always wanted to come over to All Things Open, and the 1 year I get accepted, the hands of fate are against us, but nice to join you from where I am, which I'll actually go into a little bit more in a minute. But I'm going to switch between a screen share and also a presentation. So let's go straight into presentation and take it from there. And all right. I have to move some things around very quickly. Good. So this talk has a fairly lengthy title, Reducing Negative and Biased Language in Documentation. You could probably replace documentation with many other things if you want to, but that's just where I tend to spend most of my time, and where in some cases it's somewhat easier to have a little bit more control over what we can do for tool chain choices, for the fact that documentation is something more long living than something like a blog post or something like that. But that's just where I'm going to focus on. So a little bit about each other first. I realize doing this online means it's a little harder for me to see your responses. So first, I'd just be interested, and maybe I'll come back and take a look later. Who's watching? Who's listening? Developers, writers, support, customer success people, developer relations, evangelists, educators, whatever you would like to refer to your job title as, bloggers. Yeah, who's out there? Maybe I can, here we go. I think developer, part manager, there we go. Just keep that coming. It's always interesting just to know, especially when we're talking about kind of documentation work. People come from different places, and often that's actually a good thing. But I was initially born in London, of all places. This is the wonderful English coat of arms, or UK coat of arms. Then I spent quite a lot of time in Australia with its even more wonderful coat of arms. The difference between the two is quite quite fascinating. But I actually these days live in Berlin, in Germany, where I'm joining you from right now. In fact, the Spree River is running just over there to my right. People's Republic of Berlin, as we like to call it. And that is where I am now. I work for a company called Chronosphere, which is split over New York, Lithuania, obviously me here, and a few other people in the US and around Europe as well. Relatively new company, but just to give you a little bit of context, it's a fairly technical project. So I mostly have always worked on doing documentation for developer-focused tools, trying to understand a lot of very complex work done by developers and make it understandable to other developers. Often that's usually what I do. But let's begin with a couple of disclaimers. The first one, which is important bearing in mind what I just said about my company, is this presentation really has very little to do with my work. I want to kind of get that out of the way. Firstly, because of the subject matter. I don't necessarily want to say that where I work has a problem with this kind of thing or something like that, but I just want to make it quite clear that it's not really directly related to my work at Chronosphere. It's actually more related to work I do on an open source project, where I contribute some code and integration, but also do a lot of kind of community work with, and it's more related to that. So we'll come to that later. And secondly, I feel I have to give a bit of a content warning. The whole point of this presentation is to show some very practical steps to get rid of language that we could consider to be all sorts of different things. And unfortunately, to show how to get rid of it, I kind of have to show some of it. So I'm going to give a little bit of a content warning there. I've tried to create some demo material, some demo content that is not taken from here in particular. I just sort of littered it with words I wanted to identify, but it will be coming up later, and just a bit of a warning of that. So let's carry on. So what do I mean by negative and biased language? Let's start with that first. This is what I will be looking at today. We could probably go broader and wider, depending on your own definition, but that's actually kind of one of the points of the talk, that you can kind of start to configure to look for whatever it is you want to identify. But I'm going to have a look specifically at language that is patronizing. This is actually quite common in technical copy, where, well, we'll see some examples later. I think this is probably the one that most of us are guilty of. Language that can come across as patronizing to people, intentionally or unintentionally, and make the reader feel small or insignificant or stupid, or that it's their fault they don't understand something, things like that. Rude. There's a fine line between patronizing and rude. I think possibly rude is more intentional, but sometimes there's also cultural translation issues or language translation issues that can come across as ruder than others. Overly negative. This is a harder one to pin down, to be honest with you. But yeah, just trying to make things seem more positive generally. It's a harder one to get right, but we'll look at some of that. Biased. This can be biased in a whole bunch of different ways: gender, race, age, stereotyping, all sorts of different things. And we're going to look at a few examples of those. Outdated. This is kind of another one that's hard to pin down, but of course you can come up with your own definition of what that might mean. But this can just be language that, yeah, maybe has seen its day. Maybe terms that we used to use that we don't really use anymore, or we frown upon using, things like that. And unhelpful language. This sort of connects to some of the others, but also there's some less problematic, but maybe more grammatically problematic language. There's also unhelpful words that don't add any meaning, words that can actually kind of then end up introducing some of the other problems we have outlined above. So just words that are either unnecessary or not very helpful, and much, much more. What I will end up showing you in kind of the demo part will take you down a path of realizing there's a lot you can configure to sort of identify what it is that is important to you to not be in your documentation or text. Let's also do a quick introduction to linting. Some of you may be familiar with this, some of you may not, and why it is relevant to this talk. Let's just have a little definition first, and then it'll make a bit more sense. So according to Wikipedia, linting is a static code analysis tool used to flag programming errors, bugs, stylistic errors, and suspicious constructs. Sounds great, Chris. What's that got to do with documentation? Well, I mean, we can replace a static code analysis tool. Maybe actually, maybe not. We can use it to flag language errors, grammar problems, stylistic errors, suspicious language constructs. It's actually, especially in the documentation world and the kind of tech writing world, when you're dealing with plain text most of the time, fundamentally, it's not that different from code. So there are language linters. Linters you might be familiar with in the coding world, but they exist in the language world too. And that is mostly what we're going to be looking at, sort of. So language linting, I put linting in quote marks because it kind of is, kind of isn't. We're going to be looking at human language, mostly English. That's not completely true. Some of these tools have are available in other languages as well, but they do tend to predominantly be geared towards English. Make that what you will. And there are certain areas of communities around these tools that are improving that, but that is also the language I tend to work in. I don't say I tend to work in, I do work in. So these are the tools I tend to gravitate towards. But there's a few here that might be familiar, familiar to some of you, which are not necessarily linting tools. Tools like Grammarly, for example, you might have come across. It's not quite a linter. It sort of is, but it sort of isn't. They wouldn't call themselves that. Commercial inbuilt tools, you might have noticed in Google Docs, for example, you're starting to now get grammar suggestions, AI text suggestions. They kind of vary in what they're recommending, but they're sort of starting to become a bit beyond just plain grammar. Acrolinx is something a little bit similar to Grammarly, actually based here in Berlin, extremely expensive, but you may use it if you're in an enterprise company. TextLint is one from the JavaScript world that does a bunch of different linting for language. One-use tools, I loosely term this, things like Alex, WriteGood, JobLint. You might have seen or used some of these yourself, especially if you're coming from the JavaScript world, where I think there tend to be NPM packages, so they are quite often used there. Language tool is a fairly traditional, I mean traditional in a good way, it's been around for some time tool as well that does some aspects of this. And actually language tool is also very good at supporting multiple languages. So that's a positive of it. But the one I will focus on is a tool called VALE, created primarily by one developer based out of Portland in Oregon, actually, but with a rapidly growing community around it. It's the one I've settled on, and I will cover a little bit of why I've settled on it, and then we will dig into how it actually works. That's the website, not the easiest to remember sometimes, but if you want to go and dig out more a little bit later, that's a link to have a look at. And the documentation sometimes is a little confusing. That's one of the things I'm trying to help with there as well. And you probably see why in a minute, because it's very, very configurable, which is its biggest positive, but also one of the things that makes it hard to get started with sometimes. But why do I like it? It's open source, it's fully open source. Some of those other tools we looked at are not open source at all. They're commercial tools. They have privacy issues and all sorts of things like that. It is self-hosted. You run it on your own machine. It's local. It sends nothing back to any cloud services, et cetera, et cetera. It's free. I put an asterisk there because there is now also a commercial version, which adds a couple of extra features, but I won't really focus on those. And everything I will show you can be done with the open source free version. It integrates well with other existing tools. So some of the ones I already mentioned, like WriteGood, Alex, JobLint, language tool, VALE actually replicates or packages and bundles. It depends on the one in question, but it actually integrates a lot of other tools that I already mentioned. It's very configurable. And I can see some questions coming in about configurability already, and I will be getting to those. It's quite lightweight. It's written in Golang, so it's quite lightweight. Oops. I just realized, I thought I had one more point there. Quite lightweight as well. There we go. Install options. It's pretty easy to install. Homebrew. I'm on a Mac at the moment. If you couldn't tell, that's how I install it. It's also on Chocolatey if you're in the Windows world. Linux package managers, asterisk, because actually it depends on the package manager. Docker, GitHub Action, and also editor plugins, VS Code, Atom, and a few others too. I actually maintain the VS Code one. So there we go. So that one I know fairly well. And if you use the commercial version, which is called VALE Server, you can actually get a browser plugin and Google Docs too, which is kind of, yeah, open source is allowed to commercialize sometimes, I suppose. It's a decision that has been made. If those are important to you, then there is an option to kind of build upon the open source version, but I won't really be covering that right now. Instead, it's time to jump into some demos. So let's do that. I'll jump into this now. Get that out of the way. Okay, there's my notes. If I'm ever looking over here, I'm looking at my notes. And good. Okay. So I'm wondering the best place to show this. Let me know if showing you in Finder is too hard to see. I can't change the font size too much. I can show in other ways if this is not very viewable. I'll give a couple of seconds for people to say to me, Chris, that text is too small, and I'll go to a better option, but I'm not seeing anything yet. So I will stick with this. Okay, good. So the main point of configuration is this .vale.ini file. You can also call the file other things if you like, and I'll dig into what's in that file in a minute. And then you also usually have a series of styles. I've put it in this .github folder because I also want to show you in a GitHub action later. It doesn't normally have to go in something like that. And in each collection of rules or styles, whatever you want to call it, you have a collection of YAML files that define the things you want to check for. And there's a bunch of ones that other people have written, including myself. And you can also construct your own, and we'll come to that in a minute. So that's kind of the loose structure. It's one of the sort of inherited, I can't think of the right word, inherited something or other, where, so for example, this config file will affect all files and folders in this folder and any descendants of this folder. But if I went up a level and I had a config file at this level, then it affects that level, and et cetera, et cetera. So you can, and I do this myself, I kind of have a global one for everything. And then on some individual projects, I have another config file that overrides that global one. So sort of that structure too. Let's take a quick look at this config file. It's a bit of a sneak peek there. Okay, so this is quite a basic config file at the moment. We define style path. This is pretty much needed, and that relates to what we just saw, this folder here. We define a minimum alert level, suggestion, warning, or error. This relates to a bunch of different ways we will display these errors at a later date. Most significantly, especially if you want to use VALE in something like a continuous integration build, which we will look at a little bit later, error will, of course, break a CI job, whereas the others won't. That's sort of something to bear in mind if that is something that's important to you. By default, we could say for asterisk, so on all file types, we use this config. And in this particular case, we say we want to base our checks on all the rules defined in these three styles, which are the three ones in this folder. We could also add individual overrides to the different configuration. So changing the alert level, disabling checks, for example. That can also be useful because sometimes you may have duplicate rules in different sets of rules and you maybe want to turn one off. This lets you define overridden settings for particular file types, so text file in this case. And also things like this is, so for example, the Chronosphere commercial documentation, we use MDX, which is a markdown flavor for React. And it has this MDX file extension. So in this case, I can say MDX is equal to markdown, and then VALE treats anything MDX as a markdown file. So that's another kind of, there's a lot more config you can do. That's a reasonably straightforward one. I hope I'm not falling into my own trap there by saying something like that, but it's a reasonably straightforward one, and we'll stick with for the most part. The pre-built styles come in, we have replicated a few quite popular style guides, the Microsoft style guide, the Google style guide, the IBM style guide. Also, I said, Right Good, Alex, Proslint, and a few others. Now, what do these various rules consist of? I'm going to jump back into presentation now to go through this. So, oh, sorry. And then there's also actually some kind of more business relevant style guides that some people have also replicated. So some, for example, are the Cockroach DB style guide, the Homebrew style guide, which is maintained actually by the Homebrew team, GCC, and numerous others. So we kind of have like industry recognized style guides, and if individualistic, focused on particular task style guides, and then kind of company specific ones as well. So this is where things might start to become bad news, depending on your perspective. It's basically a kind of, the rules are defined, the styles are defined in kind of a wrapped, user-friendly regular expression. A regular expression is this magical language that takes some time to understand. And once you do, it's supremely powerful, but can at times feel like absolute gibberish. And I don't fully understand it myself either. But VALE sort of, yeah, user-friendlyifies some of that a little bit. And we'll see in a minute. So things we can look for are existence, a token, a particular token we're looking for, a word, a letter, something else. Substitution. When we find a token, we would like to suggest an alternative to a token. I think you're probably starting to see what's going to happen here with some of the suggestions we can make. Occurrence, the number of occurrences of a token. This is actually good for identifying something like the Oxford comma or not, which is more of a grammatical thing you might want to look for, but you get the idea. Repetition, look for repeated token, something as simple as just you repeated this word 2 or 3 times in a row, or maybe something else. Consistency, this is actually useful, for example, for identifying inconsistent spelling between American and British spelling. Neither are wrong or right, but you want it to be consistent. Conditional, a token based on the existence of another. That one's a little harder to parse. We'll see some examples soon. Capitalization, things like conforming to title case, lowercase, uppercase, camel case, etc., in a title, in a paragraph, in a whatever it may be. Readability, this one is a little bit of an outlier. This is actually, VALE packages a bunch of readability scores you might be familiar with, and you can use those to get some feedback on your text. Spelling, there is a spell checker, which we can also override with custom tech jargon spelling words that are not really spelling errors. That's useful to know. And finally, sequence, which is a little newer. And this actually, so one of the limitations of VALE, if you use anything like Grammarly is a quote unquote kind of AI powered tool. So it has a vague sense of what you're writing about to offer suggestions. VALE, because it's mostly just looking for patterns, is not, which is a positive because of course it knows nothing about what you're writing about, but is a negative because it can't second guess the context of what you're writing about. Sequence is VALE is starting to inherit some elements of natural language processing, not to the level of something that's powered by AI or machine learning, but being able to look for patterns and make judgments based on patterns in a more nuanced way. It's a much newer feature and one I haven't experimented with massively yet, but it's there and it's kind of improving in more recent versions. So you can start to do more complex stuff if you want, but I'm not really going to go into it right now. Okay, that was a quick slide. Time for some more demos. In fact, the kind of full-on chunky part of the, okay, let's have a look at the demo text I'm going to use. I've got it over here in a different text editor right now. So I've written something fairly arbitrary here, littered with all sorts of problems. I won't bother reading it out too much. You can already see some terminology that the tech industry has been arguing back and forth about whether we should use or not, things like that. We also have terminology that is unhelpful. We have what we might declare outdated terms. We have gendered terms. We have culturally inappropriate terms. We have a whole bunch of things in here. So we would like to identify some of these and, if possible, even offer some suggestions to them. So this is fine. This is good. How do we check this? So we can step through some of the different ways we can do this. The quickest is going to be with command line. So at a very basic level, we use the command line command and add the file, and we'll get a fairly lengthy list of all sorts of problems here. So just out of pure interest, we could see line 3, column 4, a warning. Try to avoid using first person plural. That's less kind of biased and negative, but more grammatical. Here's one here, for example, line 5, column 17, using simple may come across as condescending. And actually, this is a duplicate rule that is suggesting things in a slightly different way. It can also come across as hyperbolic. It can be condescending in that calling something simple can make someone who finds it difficult feel condescended, but also it's often not needed. I have kind of a rule of thumb around using words like simple and just and easy and things like that is your software or whatever it is you're working on should explain how, or should demonstrate how easy something is. You shouldn't have to tell people it's easy. It should just be apparent to them, hopefully. Things like just as well. Here is one on the terminology. So verify your use of terms like master and slave. And we could, so we actually on this one, for example, have suggestions instead. Consider using primary, hub, or reference. And we could also add things like main to that list as well, et cetera, et cetera. We can start to see a lot of options here. Consider using block list, wrong list, ban list, deny list, etc. And a bunch of other different options here, which we will see in a more clear way shortly, actually. So how does this look? How have we configured this? Let's take a couple of examples off the list and dive into how the rule has been defined and see how all I've covered so far is kind of applied into something useful, hopefully. Let's start with this one, maybe. So Alex, condescending. So we can figure out from that it's in the Alex set, and we can look at the rule here. So this is using an existence check. We can set a message saying using, and this is passing in what was found, can come across as condescending, and with a link as well. We actually recently discovered a little bit of a bug with VALE that this link is not really shown anywhere. It's something we will be fixing. Is it an error, a warning, or a suggestion? Is it case sensitive? And then what to look for example. So that is probably one of the simpler rules to configure. Let's have a look at, what's another one we could have a look at? Maybe a lot of them tend to be existence and substitution because they're the easier sorts of ones to check for. But here's a substitution one based on race inside Alex. So this is using the substitution style. The message is consider using this instead of this. Again, ignore case, level warning, and action. This action one is something that only relates to the commercial version of VALE, actually giving you an option to also do a replacement as opposed to just suggest. So that is possibly one of the only small things that is not covered in the open source version. And then we can see, we get the idea here. I won't go into masses of detail here, but you can see some of the sorts of things we looked for, and it offers alternatives to them. And you could go through this and change them to whatever you wish to. Maybe one more, if I can think of one that is a little different from those two. I think a lot of them are going to be slightly similar, of course, because it's the main sorts of things we're looking for. But you start to see, that we're also duplicating in a few cases here as well. Yeah, I think they're all going to be largely similar in these cases because we're looking for particular instances of things as opposed to anything more subtle than that in those cases. So this is fine. Running by a CLI is okay. This is quite a lot to look through. So what about another option? What about in my code editor? That would be nice. I already alluded to the fact there is a code editor and you can actually already see it doing things here. But here's the same piece of text in Visual Studio Code. And we're very quickly visually here seeing the problematic terms, and the underline is relevant to the level of error we set. So this is This is, actually, it doesn't show me there, does it? But this is suggestion, this is error, and blue is, sorry, suggestion is blue, orange is warning, and then yellow is error. And we can also see that down in the problems pane if we want to. This would also show us that, okay, fine, I'd like to know a bit more about why that's flagged. I can actually click onto the rule itself and find out more as well. Yeah, and you can see here we're also getting the duplicates as well. And we can start to maybe correct some of this. So maybe something like our software is understandable. I don't know. May not be the best suggestion right now, but just to give an indication, the database with a, let's go for, I think I'm going to go for documentary. Okay, yeah, I did spell that correctly. Anyone can understand it. I mean, to be honest with you, I'd probably just get rid of that. And etc. We could go through some things like this. Let's look at some of the others here. It could, I'm not sure if harm is going to be any better. No, or slightly better. Of course, we can discuss terminology and which terminology we prefer and customize these rules to do that for ourselves. And then, yeah, things like down here around gender as well. So we could see, yep, you get the idea. Office sales. For example, oops, spell that correctly. Yeah. And then, yes, things like guys. There's a lot more we could start to see. So that's useful when we're editing ourselves. What about when we're collaborating with others? Obviously, we can distribute these rules around our team, and we hope that when it gets to a pull request, things have been somewhat changed, and what we're looking for is not there anymore. But something on a CI would also be useful. As VALE is a command line tool, you can connect it up to pretty much any CI that supports Docker. But I'm going to specifically focus on looking at a GitHub action, which is something that has been prepackaged. And I do have an example here. So I opened up a pull request earlier where I made some attempts to improve the text as far as I thought. You know, I wanted to make some changes. We can see that the check didn't necessarily agree with me, and we can jump in to get an idea. I think you get the idea of what's going to happen here. It'll look pretty much the same, list the same problems, but again in a different way. There is also a configuration option you can add to annotate the changes instead of it being in a list like this. So it's actually more helpful in line in place instead of just in a long list. But that will relate to one of my slightly later points. That is a kind of essential thing to try and do with VALE as well. Okay, so those are the main interaction ways to use the tool and slowly make changes. And this kind of relates, I guess, to one of the issues that can come when you introduce a tool like this into your workflow, that you want to use it to improve things. But if you give people too much information, too many things they need to fix, people will have a tendency of ignoring it because there's just too much to look at. Like, for example, we have here at the moment, it's quite a lot to go through. In fact, yeah, there's even more down here. So there's quite a lot to go through. There's an easy temptation to just enable a lot of things and push it out and think, oh, great. Now everyone who writes things will filter out all these changes and make these changes and improve our copy in these myriad different ways. But of course, sometimes when you give people too much information like this or like this, the opposite can happen. People tend to ignore it because it's just too much to look at. So there is a little bit of a need to kind of, I would say, train VALE, because it's not a machine learning algorithm. It doesn't need training per se, but to almost train your use of it and tame it a bit to to maybe go through and have a big sweep of things first before you introduce it to a team, because so they're not overwhelmed when you do this. Also, of course, to be think very carefully about what causes error versus warning. So, for example, you might want to say that something that could come across as racist breaks a build. Something like this, the simple, the just, they're not great grammar. They're kind of annoying, but it's not as important to remove them. So maybe they're a warning. And something like, I don't know, this was somewhat randomly configured, so I'm trying to think of a good one. But you get the idea. Then you have suggestions as well. So you need to kind of tame it a little bit before pushing it out to a wider group of collaborators. And that is often where people stumble a little bit setting it up in the first place. Is the tech writer person gets very excited, rolls it out to the developers. The developers are like, "Oh my God, there's too much to look at. I'm ignoring it," and then you haven't really accomplished anything. So that's probably an important thing to look into too. I can actually see someone said this will make a great Slack bot too. So this is actually this has become an interesting thing we've looked at a few times, because I've alluded to like VALE server also offering these options in the browser and things like that, because at the moment this is helping us with kind of people working with technical style copy in markdown files, in text editors, in GitHub, things like that. But if we want to enable also people in other departments who are maybe using Google Docs or communicating in Slack and things like that, it's where things get a little harder, unfortunately, at the moment. Mostly because VALE is running as a binary. Again, its biggest positive is one of its biggest negatives when it comes to something like this. It's running as a binary, not as an API endpoint. So putting it into something like Slack is difficult. Not impossible, but difficult. That's kind of something to bear in mind. And it's that balancing act between self-hosted and needing an API and an endpoint and things like that. So yeah, there are some limitations, but it's open source. So see if you can figure out what you would like to do, I suppose. Okay, that is mostly what I wanted to cover, and we have a little bit of time for some questions. If you want to talk to me some more, that's my personal website where I work for all your observability needs. And if you're looking for a job, of course, and my Twitter for random stuff I tweet about. I already shared the VALE website. There's also an unofficial kind of support channel in the Write the Docs, which is a grouping kind of community organization of tech writers, writethedocs.org. They have a Slack channel as well that you can find on writethedocs.org. And there is a confusingly called Test the Docs Slack channel there, where a lot of people are playing around with VALE too. So you can find some kind of more synchronous support there as well. But that is me mostly done. And I will jump into some questions. I can see a few. Let's see. This is where I have to. Okay. So firstly, I can see one here, Elizabeth Brown, who I think jumped off a bit later, but so may not hear my answer. Can you instrument VALE with custom words and phrases to check for? Yes, you can do it in a bunch of different ways, actually. You can do it in, there's actually a couple of different ways. I could show a demo, but then I might get lost in showing demos and run out of time. You could do it in the spelling type way, where you have a list of custom like jargon. And I have a VALE rule I've created that kind of tries to emulate Grammarly and adds a lot of tech jargon and things like that adds those as an exception to not be flagged as spelling mistakes. There's also another method where you can add like kind of your brand, your rules, whatever it may be, set of terminology, and then that's excluded from different rules appropriately. So there's kind of two different ways to doing it, depending what you want to do. But you will find mentions of that in the documentation. For the GitHub action, do we need to have all of the rules in a repository? And can you reference upstream rule sets? So that's a good question. You don't. The example I showed was just the simplest way to do it, but you can. And actually, I can show this quite easily because I have it open here. You can, in the configuration for the action, you can set remote repositories for styles, remote repositories for config, and you can also actually merge the remote one and the local one together. So there's quite a bit of flexibility there, actually. And I saw something in the Q&A as well. Is this demo project available? Actually, yes, it is. I didn't think to even mention that, but it is. I will paste the link, I think, because it's not very memorable. It's on my GitHub somewhere. I probably will turn this into a blog post at some point and talk people through it a little bit, but here is the link to that repository. There we go. And I think that is all the questions for now. If anyone has any more questions, let me know. But apart from that, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or email chris@christianschiller.com if you want to ask any more questions. Joseph, the main maintainer of the project, is also very responsive as well and knows far more than me. so yeah, thank you very much for your time and enjoy the rest of the conference.